I am honored to be here in Batesburg, Leesville, to recognize the service of Sergeant Isaac Woodard to his service of Isaac Woodard to his nation, and to remember the grave injustice inflicted on him while he was wearing the uniform of his country. If I could just for a moment take the liberty to recognize a couple of, it's dangerous when you do that, but I want to recognize Mr. Robert Young and his wife, who, Mr. Young was the nephew and caregiver of Isaac Woodard, and he has been on this journey with me for a number of years. Could you stand up, Mr. Young, please? I would also just take the liberty of identifying several of my judicial colleagues, Senior United States Judge Margaret Seymour, Judge Michelle Childs, and retired Chief Justice of South Carolina, Gene Toll. Thank you for being here. Late in the afternoon of February 12, 1946, Isaac Woodard boarded a Greyhound bus in Augusta, Georgia, after discharge hours earlier from nearby Camp Gordon, and was traveling to Columbia, South Carolina, and then to his hometown of Winnsboro, where he was to rendezvous with his wife after several years of separation. During one of the frequent stops along the way, Woodard approached the white bus driver and asked if he could step off the bus for a moment to relieve himself. At that time, interstate buses did not have restrooms, and Greyhound drivers were instructed to accommodate such requests from their passengers. Instead, the bus driver cursed Woodard and told him, "I ain't got time to wait, and go back to your seat." To his apparent astonishment, Woodard responded back, "Talk to me like I'm talking to you. I am a man, just like you." The stunned bus driver told Woodard to go ahead, but at the next stop in Batesburg, the bus driver, now no longer concerned with staying on schedule, departed his bus in search of a police officer to have Woodard removed from the bus and arrested. Woodard soon found himself confronted by the police chief of Batesburg, South Carolina, Linwood Shaw, who responded to Woodard's effort to explain himself by striking him over the head with his blackjack and escorting him off to the town jail. On the way, Woodard was repeatedly beaten with Shaw's blackjack, ultimately driving the end of the baton into both of his eyes. The sergeant was then thrown in a semi-conscious state into the jail cell for the night. When he awoke the next morning, he realized he could not see. Later that morning, Woodard was taken to the town court and convicted of drunk and disorderly conduct. Accounts of the Woodard beating and blinding were reported in the black press and received nationwide attention when Orson Welles focused on the incident in his weekly national radio program on ABC Radio. Mass meetings were organized in black communities across the nation to protest Woodard's treatment. And a benefit concert for Sergeant Woodard in New York City, headed by Joe Louis and featuring such luminaries as Count Basie, Cab Calloway, and Nat King Cole, played to a sold-out audience of 23,000. Meanwhile, other black veterans returning to their homes in the rural South confronted other incidents of racial violence. No state prosecuted those involved in any of those racial incidents. On September 19, 1946, a delegation of civil rights leaders met with President Truman in the White House, deeply distressed about this wave of racial violence. Prior to the meeting, Truman's staff advised him that despite his desire to respond to the concerns of the civil rights leaders, there was little he could do as president to address this situation. Criminal prosecutions by the federal government for civil rights violations in the South were fraught with problems, most notably all-white juries deeply unsympathetic to civil rights cases. Further, Congress was under the control of powerful Southern committee chairs who were determined to block even the most modest civil rights legislation. As the meeting opened, civil rights leaders urged the president to call Congress back into special session to address the spreading violence against black veterans. The president expressed sympathy, but lamented there was little he could do because there was little public support for such legislation. Leading the group was Walter White, the executive secretary of the NAACP and Truman's most loyal supporter in the civil rights community. It was apparent to White that the president did not appreciate the gravity of the situation. White changed the discussion by sharing with President Truman in detail the blinding of Isaac Woodard. As the tragic story unfolded, Truman sat riveted and became visibly agitated with the idea of a uniformed and decorated American soldier being so cruelly treated. Abandoning the advice of his staff, Truman stated, "My God, I had no idea it was as terrible as that. We have got to do something." The following day, Truman wrote his Attorney General, Tom Clark, and shared with him the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard, noting the police officer had deliberately put out Woodard's eyes. Truman made it clear that the time for federal action had now arrived. He further indicated he intended to appoint the first Presidential Committee on Civil Rights to propose a new agenda to address America's serious racial problems. 3 business days after Truman's letter was delivered to the Attorney General, the Department of Justice announced the prosecution of Batesburg Police Chief Shull in the Federal District Court of South Carolina for the deprivation of the civil rights of Isaac Woodard. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice prepared the necessary documents to organize the first Presidential Committee on Civil Rights. Truman charged his committee in his first meeting in January 1947 to be bold and to attack the root causes of America's deep-seated racial problems. In less than a year after its formation, the Truman Civil Rights Committee issued a landmark report, To Secure These Rights, which graphically detailed America's profound racial challenges and proposed groundbreaking policies and legislation, including the ending of segregation in the armed forces of the United States. Truman fully embraced the Civil Rights Committee's proposals, and on July 26, 1948, in the midst of his re-election campaign, he issued Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of America's armed forces. The successful desegregation of the military marked the beginning of the end of Jim Crow in America. In the summer of 1948, as Truman was preparing to launch his re-election campaign and facing a third-party challenge from the Dixiecrats because of his civil rights agenda, a friend from Missouri, Ernest Roberts, wrote the president, urging him to back off his civil rights program or face certain defeat. Truman responded in a personal note, which he instructed his library not to release until after his death. He shared with his friend the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Truman concluded the letter by stating, "I can't agree to such goings-on, and I shall never approve it. I am going to remedy it, and if that ends up in my failure to be reelected, that failure will be in a good cause." The Justice Department's efforts to prosecute Linwood Shull in the Federal District Court in Columbia produced, in the short term, a predictable result. An all-white jury acquitted the police chief after only 28 minutes of deliberations. The case was tried before United States District Judge J. Wadis Waring, a Charleston patrician whose father was a Confederate veteran and multiple generations of ancestors had been slaveholders. Prior to the trial, Judge Waring was skeptical about the federal government's prosecution of a local police officer, but his views changed when he heard the highly credible testimony of the blinded sergeant who described his arrest and vicious beating by the police chief. As Shull's supporters cheered his acquittal, few noticed that Judge Waring's wife, Elizabeth, who had attended the trial, left the courtroom in tears. Waring later joined his wife, and both were traumatized by the trial over which he had just presided. The Shull trial forced the judge and his wife to stare directly into the Southern racial abyss, a view that would forever transform both of them. Waring later described the trial as his personal baptism of fire and his Michigan-born wife's baptism in racial prejudice.